Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.
We welcome you to another roundtable discussion of the Doctrine and Covenants. Joining me today are professors of church history and doctrine from Brigham Young University. Directly across the table from me is Richard Cowan. Welcome, Richard.
Good to be here.
John Livingstone and Lawrence Flake. Nice to have you here, Lawrence.
Thank you, Matt.
And I'm Matthew Richardson, Associate Dean of Religious Education. Today we will be discussing from the Doctrine and Covenants, section 69 through section 75. Brethren, we have a lot of material to cover, but interestingly enough, this is almost like a potpourri of revelations, hitting and missing on different topics and combining them together in wonderful ways. Perhaps we ought to frame this quickly at least the first couple of sections. Richard, maybe you can give us a historical background, kind of frame this up so that we have something to add to as we go through these sections.
Well, 1831 is the second year of the church's existence. Remember, it was organized April 6th, 1830. And the early saints really were eager to have copies of the revelations. You know, we just casually, as we walk out the door to go to church, say, oh, I better get my scriptures. Well, they didn't have that privilege. Well, in November of 1831, a conference met and decided to publish several thousand copies of the Revelations. And section 69 was given soon after that, the same month, and had to do with you might say, the mechanics. The publication was not going to be done in Ohio, but out in Missouri, where the church had a press. And so arrangements were made to take the manuscript of the Revelations there. And then section 70 considers some of the matters concerning the income that would be generated by the publication of the Revelations. And Joseph Smith's stewardship was to be the prophet of the church, the president of the church. That was his full-time assignment. And just like any other steward in those days was entitled to receive support, he was. And the decision was made that that would be funded, at least in part, from the sale of these books.
You know, it's interesting you bring up the word steward and stewardship. I found when I was rereading these sections how many times stewardship kept on coming and accountability in these sections. The Lord is giving a responsibility, an opportunity to serve, but then He will hold us accountable for that, and He does that through appropriate means. Well, let's take a look. Let's jump into section 69. As Richard was saying, is the mechanics for the publication are being outlined. It's interesting that Oliver Cowdery gets the assignment to go and transport the manuscript and to Missouri, and then we find out here in section 69 that John Whitmer will accompany Oliver to Missouri as well.
I think it's interesting that they're taking not only the manuscript but some money, and even today in the church, boy, when bishoprics open tithing funds, always supposed to be two people, and so we've got Oliver and John who are going to go together to take care of this.
Good point.
I think it's interesting that the Lord is using the occasion to help John Whitmer by instructing him to be instructed by Oliver Cowdery. So it shows the Lord's confidence in Oliver Cowdery and his desire that John Whitmer be strengthened in his calling as church historian.
Kind of sounds like he maybe needed it, because later on, of course, John falls away and takes some of the church history with him.
You know, isn't it interesting when you read through the Doctrine and Covenants with the view of hindsight, we can see how pertinent even the small advice that are given to these individuals at the time, how important that advice was, and perhaps that's charged to us to take things seriously when we apply these principles. Let's look at verse 5. And also my servants who are abroad in the earth should send forth the accounts of their stewardships to the land of Zion. And then in verse 6, for the land of Zion shall be a seat and a place to receive and do these things. So here we see the notion of stewardship and accounting that stewardship to the principle of Zion. Any thoughts on that, or on the notion of it's a place to receive and to do these things that the Lord has given?
I really think that, the Lord always seems to, with our individual agency, when He gives us responsibilities, He really does want a reporting back, a stewardship account. And like we say, even today, where we report our stewardships, whether that's in an interview or whether it's a formal report that's going to leaders, we send forth accounts of our stewardship. Sometimes that's financial, sometimes it's just, priesthood-oriented, but we still do it today.
And at this time, the only bishop in the church was in Missouri, which is what the Lord was referring to when He talked about Zion.
Right.
So in that very, specific sense, the accounting of the stewardship was being taken to the bishop in Missouri. But I think, Matt, as you're suggesting, the concept is broader, that there is this idea of we still have the responsibility of building Zion. And we still have the responsibility of accounting to those who preside over us, whether it be a priesthood leader, a bishop, or stake president, whatever our individual calling might suggest.
Good point.
I like the word seat, indicating the importance of Zion, not only then but now, a place to receive and do these things. So he's talking about then and obviously about the future as well.
And we're going to see that coming up in some of our future revelations here that we're going to be discussing today, where it talks about establishing powers and setting a location and a place where we have information coming that is sure and steady. John, what were you going to bring up?
I was just going to point out that John Whitmer is being counseled here to travel many times, this is verse 7, from place to place and from church to church, that he may more easily obtain knowledge. We just have a situation where he's supposed to know what's going on as the church historian, and preaching and expounding, writing, copying, selecting, obtaining. Boy, the Lord wants him to have a pretty thorough knowledge of what's going on in the church, and for that to be recorded, so we have it.
Well, and then, excuse me, go ahead.
Verse 8, he talks about the value
Right.
of this history.
That's
right. And as a teacher of church history, I'm glad to know that the Lord values it for the benefit of the church and the rising generation.
Well, it's interesting, Richard, you said the rising generation, and I happened to circle in my book an S on the end of that word. It's generations. So I thought that's kind of interesting, because it would seem like it would just say the rising generation, but apparently for generations to come, that would
That's
be
right. And I guess we're talking here about church history, but I suspect that this applies to most of us more directly in terms of our own personal or family histories.
I think you're right. And it says that they shall grow up to the land of Zion. Well, let's move on. Let's take a look at section 70. As Richard outlined for us so well, is the background here is dealing with the publication and with stewardship. What might we draw out of section 70 that is necessary to look at in light of what's taking place here with the literary firm?
I like the idea in verse 1 that the Lord really is talking to everyone. Boy, listen to this. Behold and hearken, O ye inhabitants of Zion, and all ye people of my church who are afar off, and hear the word of the Lord, which I give unto my servant Joseph Smith, Jr.
Sounds like section 1, almost.
It really does.
I see that throughout.
And clearly, the Lord wants to speak to more than just these leaders, and the publication of the revelations and making sure that things get out to the membership of the church. And quite frankly, we know that many of the revelations are to the whole world and not just the church. The Lord's pretty clear on that point.
Okay. Other things that come up, for example, let's look at verse 3. Here's that notion of stewardship and accountability again. I, the Lord, have appointed them and ordained them to be stewards over the revelations and commandments which I have given unto them, and which I shall hereafter give unto them. And then here's verse 4. And an account of this stewardship will I require of them in the day of judgment. That stewardship coming at various times and perhaps in various depths, perhaps.
I think it's interesting in the background for this revelation that the prophet said that the conference voted that the revelations were to be worth the riches of the whole earth. And the idea of treasuring those, caring for those, and even in our day and time to be stewards over the revelations and commandments, because they're really of more worth than all of the material things there are on the earth.
Go ahead, Richard.
Don't you think that the Lord's going to require of us, we're talking here about stewardship concerning publishing the commandments, but I wonder if we aren't going to be called to account for what we have done with that which was published. In other words, what are we doing with the Scriptures? We live in an era when the gospel in its fullness has been restored. And I suspect that when we talk about stewardship, our whole life being on earth at the time when all these blessings are available, where the Lord said, when much is given, much is expected.
Yeah. Good point, John.
I think you're right. I think these revelations and how we hold them and how we teach them to our children, has everything to do with what the Lord wants done. Clearly, these brethren, of course, were publishing them, but like Richard was saying, how do we receive them? Are we teaching them to our children? Are we droning on and on? Are we making them interesting? What are we doing to make sure that the revelations get into the hearts and minds of our own kids?
And I don't think it's too far of a stretch to apply this into the general notion of stewardship. For look at verse 9. Behold, this is what the Lord requires of every man in his stewardship, even as I, the Lord, have appointed. Now listen to this is interesting. Or shall hereafter appoint to or unto any man. There's that notion of stewardship, and this is a pattern for all, not just for these individuals.
And he caps it off in verse 10. Behold, none are exempt from this law who belong to the church of the living God.
Yeah, and how many do none include? Well, oh, wow, okay,
Yeah.
so this is important. Let's take a look at verse 14. There's an interesting little snippet right here where the Lord says, nevertheless, in your temporal things you shall be equal. Now listen to this. And this not grudgingly. Maybe that's the interesting part here. Otherwise, the abundance of the manifestations of the Spirit will be withheld. Any thoughts on this? This comes up often in teaching where some will say, well, what if I don't do it with the right spirit? Maybe I shouldn't do it at all. Or kind of an interesting thing that's being brought up here in this notion of stewardship, remuneration of sorts for the stewardship, the accountability. But here's an interesting line there. And this not grudgingly in verse 14. Any thoughts on that?
We might begin with just the concept of equal, because the Lord has a little different definition of equal than some of the rest of us. Equal doesn't mean that everybody has the same amount. It's section 51, verse 3, every man equal according to his family, according to his circumstances and his wants and needs. So, and that's the same way the welfare program works today. It's so equal is the Lord's definition of equal, not man's definition.
Good point. And there's something about the notion of a willingness of a servant to enter into that concept of equality, which is so different in some ways in our own society.
I suppose, too, that really he's saying that whether we have more or we have less, if we're called upon to give more, we ought not to do it grudgingly. If we have less, maybe we ought to not look at the fact that we have less in a grudging, how can I say this? President Benson, I think, used to refer to those who have not in their pride, wishing that they did. And boy, there can kind of be a pride on the high end of that, and there can be a pride on the low end of that.
Well, isn't it interesting? We're talking about concepts of Zion. Granted, we have geographical locations that we're dealing with at this time period as well, but that doesn't remove us from the principle of Zion. And sometimes we get the notion of an inhabitant of Zion as someone who just lives in the geographical location, when it seems that everything that we're talking about here is developing the hearts of and the inhabitants themselves, that they become Zionistic. And where is there room for this notion of being someone that holds grudges or comparing and contrasting, always feeling the lack thereof, and doing things without the willing heart?
Every stake that there is in the church is known as a stake of Zion.
Right.
So no matter where we live, we are building Zion.
Good point. Let's take a look at section 71. We're moving now into 71, 72, where we start to see stewardships of a different type, not necessarily just to the printing, but we see also the experience of a stewardship in laboring in the field, laboring within, as Richard was saying, is the areas of Zion. We have a bishop in Missouri, and we see some interesting things taking place therewith. Section 71, given in December of 1831, and several nice comments in here. Let's take a peek there at section 71. Richard, you mentioned to me some comments you had about verse 1 of opening mouths, proclaiming gospel, and this notion of expounding the mysteries, etc.
I had some missionary companions who would have loved to have seen that verse, the directive to expound the mysteries. But, we usually think that we're supposed to leave the mysteries alone. And Well, there are. The mysteries that haven't been revealed, we should leave alone, such as fixing a date for the second coming. But a mystery, I guess in this sense, is anything that cannot be known through human resources alone, but needs to be revealed.
Right.
The gospel itself, the atonements and its effects, faith, in all these things. And that is what we should be expounding. There's another scripture that in which the brethren were told to expound the mysteries out of the scriptures. So that would give us a clue as to which mysteries we should be expounding.
Well, I was thinking as you were talking about your definition of those things known by revelation, well, and then the relationship of the Scriptures, wouldn't we hold up our entire Doctrine and Covenants in a sense of that? For these were revealed by revelation, right. And what a wonderful resource that is.
As Latter-day Saints, we know a lot of things that are mysteries to the rest of the world, and they can seem to us to be fairly basic, but just think of the saving ordinances of the kingdom: baptism, gift of the Holy Ghost, Melchizedek priesthood ordination, endowment, being sealed to a companion in a temple. To us, those are fairly common, but to the rest of the world, those really are mysteries.
It's interesting when we look at Section 71. If we look at the framing here, there are some problems with persecution, and some of these events, especially pertinent to Section 71, would be dealing with a fellow by the name of Ezra Booth, who was one of our own, at least in the initial stages, starts writing some letters that are printed in the Ohio Star that are very critical of the prophet Joseph and the church. And so you see this intensity. And when we start off with verse 1, I can't help but think in context of what's happening of Alma chapter 1 through 5 almost. You have a situation where there are problems going on in the external. What should we do? And the Lord tells Alma, go and preach. And do you get that sense here almost in the same way? Boy, are there storm clouds on the events. What should I do, Lord? And go open your mouths, proclaim my gospel, labor, and verse 4, labor in my vineyard, call upon the inhabitants of the earth, and bear record and prepare the way.
It's interesting, too, that the context of all of these sections is that Joseph is heavily involved in the work on the Joseph Smith translation at this point. And so for the Lord to call him away from that labor and send him and Sidney out, you know it must have been important. And it is kind of interesting. We'd had other anti-Mormon things right from the beginning. In fact, the first anti-Mormon was before the publishing of the Book of Mormon, that far back. But this is the first member, former member, who turned on the church. And in fact, there's two of them. The one is mentioned Ezra Booth, but the other one is Simon's Riders.
Right.
And the two of them were involved in this, and so it was a serious enough thing that the Lord directed them to go and do, I guess you could call it public relations, because it had been damaging to have these 7 or 9 articles published in the newspaper.
One of the things I love about this is it gives them almost a confidence to be able to leave that important work of the translation of the JST and go with confidence to do exactly what you're saying. And we see that in this section where he builds the confidence, for example, in verse 9. Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, there is no weapon that is formed against you shall prosper. That's interesting. And if any man lift up his voice against you, he shall be confounded in that's the Lord's own due time. And it's almost like, don't panic, don't feel like you have to straighten the course of the ship, it's not going to sink without you. Have confidence, go about what I've asked you to do, which we see clearly there in verse 1. And what a powerful confidence that is, that I would assume, I believe it applies to us equally today.
Even though there's the phrase, confound your enemies here, maybe that was more necessary when the church was just young and tender. The counsel today is that really follow the main thrust of Section 71, that is to preach the gospel and let that stand, teach what we believe, what we know to be true, rather than contending and specifically responding to problems and so forth. But let the Lord handle that, and let those who would attack, and let us put that out which the Spirit can bear testimony of to those who are seekers of truth.
And I think that's the point is, if this is really the Lord's kingdom, let's do it the Lord's way. And this is not a man's kingdom. I remember a quote by Joseph F. Smith where he said, but remember that God leads the work. It is His, it is not man's. it had it been the work of Joseph Smith or of Brigham Young or of John Taylor or of, he goes on and lists several here, it would not have endured the tests of time. And so it's almost have confidence and do it my way. This was going to work out. And verse 9 is there, it will not prosper in my own due time.
In verse 11, the Lord gives the bottom line to this and just about everything else when he says, "Wherefore, keep my commandments. They are true and faithful."
Yeah.
So that's where you come back to. You don't get distracted by these things.
Okay, I have to do this, but John, I'm going to put you on the spot. It's one of my favorite quotes that come here, and I think it has great relevance to section 71. When we were talking about it, you didn't even look down; you have this memorized, but I think that it really portrays that wonderful notion here of having the confidence. It's going to go forward. Let's go forward. So here we go. I'm putting you on the spot.
Joseph Smith literally said, "The standard of truth has been erected, and no unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. Persecutions may rage, mobs may combine, armies may assemble, calumny may defame, but the truth of God will go forth boldly, nobly, independent, till it's penetrated every continent, visited every clime, swept every country, sounded in every ear, till the purposes of God shall be accomplished. The great Jehovah shall say, the work is done."
Well, we're running out of time, so let's take a look at section 72 and frame section 72 and forge ahead. Here we have, as Richard was mentioning, a notion of stewardships with a bishop who is in Missouri. The accounting, that's quite a distance to account for just physically, and one of the nice things that come out of this section in section 72 in December, it involves Newell K. Whitney. And I love the account of this in verse 8 where he says unto Newell K. Whitney, "My servant." Newell K. Whitney is the man who shall be appointed and ordained unto this power, and we have another bishop called in the church. And
First time Joseph met Newell K. Whitney, do you remember him saying,
yeah.
"Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man." It's almost as if it's been repeated right here.
Well, go ahead, please.
It clearly was time. I like up in verse 2, "Verily thus saith the Lord, it is expedient in me for a bishop to be appointed unto you, or of you, unto the church in this part of the Lord's vineyard." The church is expanding and growing. In a sense, they're splitting the ward. Even though it's long distances here, we're clearly going to have another bishop who's going to have responsibilities.
This time in Ohio.
That's right, and in Ohio. So now we have the two bishops set up. And one of the nice things about this is apparently this is a two-part section, and so we go down to about verse 8, and apparently that's where Newell K. Whitney is made a bishop. And then we get back to verse 9, and one of the things I like about this, the Lord calls him, and then he gives him a good outline. Here's what a bishop does, by the way. Here's some of the duties in your stewardship in verses 9 through, down through the end to 26, and it's nice. Section 73, here we see more dealing with, for example, some of the things that are coming with engaging in preaching. Any thoughts or to bring up? Section 73, we can actually tie in also with section 75 as well, with the callings of the elders.
I think it's just important to know that they had gone out, they had preached, they tried to deal with the issues that Ezra Booth had been raising, and now it's time to, in a sense, come back, start the translation again. Joseph Smith translation can continue.
It's interesting that the elders are anxious for some type of guidance, and in verse 4 it says, "Keep on working until we come to the conference, and then you'll receive more instruction." And then here's an interesting line, verse 5. "And let this be a pattern unto the elders until further knowledge, even as it is written." So it's wait, and it'll come from a source, and it'll come in conferences. And then I love verse 6, "Gird up your loins and be sober, and let's go work." Let's take a look at section 74. Richard, you mentioned a little bit about section 74.
In 73, the brethren were told, as John just mentioned, to resume translating. And some people wonder, translating what? The Book of Mormon's already published. Well, the prophet used the word translate to refer to what he was doing in what we've often called the inspired revision of the Bible. And so that's what they were getting back to. And as a question came up in relation to a statement in the New Testament about families and marriage, this became the occasion for a revelation on that subject. And it's interesting to see how questions that arose in this project of translation paved the way, opened the door for revelations we now have in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Well said.
Even in section 75, we see these elders wanting to know what's up, and the Lord is so specific here, where he starts assigning companionships and telling them where they ought to go, and eastern, southern, house to house, village to village.
It's interesting that he, in verse 19 and 20, he says, enter into the house, and if they receive you, leave your blessing. If they reject you, then you shake off the dust of your feet, or as a testimony against them. But then verse 21 says, and you shall be filled with joy and gladness. I've always thought that was interesting, that he's saying you're going to be filled with joy and gladness even if they reject you. And that's comfort for missionaries that are called to Poland or Czechoslovakia instead of to Chile or somewhere where they have lots of success. So he will bless them either way, whether they're accepted or not accepted.
And being a former mission president, both you and John, former mission presidents, I think you speak with some essence of confidence that you've seen that happen. And
the prophet Joseph Smith said, if you do your duty, it will be as well with you as if all men accepted the gospel.
Well, with that in mind, maybe we could close with verse 29. Let every man be diligent in all things, and the idler shall not have place in the church, except he repent and mend his ways. There's being diligent in what we have as our stewardship, whatever that may be. Well, thank you very much for an enlightening discussion. It's always nice to be with friends and look at scriptural commentary.
It's good to be friends with you, too.
Thank you.
Visit our website to find out more about the Doctrine and Covenants. Go to byubroadcasting.org. Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.